Welcome to this episode of the Viking Virtual Resident Historian. It's part of our ongoing cultural enrichment program and our commitment to destination-focused learning. A series that takes you further with unique perspectives and intriguing insights. It analyzes and puts into context important chapters of world history. The Viking Virtual Resident Historian puts history at your fingertips. We hope you'll find this episode enriching.
Hello, my name is Charles Doherty. This lecture is the second in a series addressing the history of the Netherlands, and today we discuss the glories of the 17th century up to the present. And our lecture here is subtitled The Golden Age and After. As you can see, this roadmap delineates the key topics to be addressed over the course of both lectures. Having examined the early Dutch history of the Roman and Viking periods, we talked about early Hanseatic traders moving locally sourced goods within the Baltic region during the 14th and 15th centuries, prior to the arrival of large ocean-going vessels. We also looked at the creation of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, and their explorations for finding more and efficient means to source luxury goods from the Far East. Also, Dutch colonial interests in both the Americas and Africa, but as well in Asia. We addressed the period known as the Spanish Netherlands, when the Dutch were under the shackles and scrutiny of the Spanish King Philip II, eventually leading to William of Orange and the Dutch Revolt. Today, we'll pick up where we left off, around the year 1600. As Holland's economic power is on the ascendancy, coupled with her growing confidence, both of these components will help create her most extraordinary golden age of the 17th century. Furthermore, we'll consider more recent Dutch history as well, outlining the country's role during various periods of war and conflict during the 19th and 20th centuries. And lastly, spend a few moments to consider the important role of Holland within the European Union today. However, we must turn to a closer examination of this golden age to which I have frequently referred. In order to grasp the key components contributing to the Dutch ascendancy on the 17th century European stage, we need to consider four particular components central to our discussion. The Dutch people. How might we summarize the Dutch and their worldview that directs us toward an understanding of their century, the 17th century? Also, what about their geography, the land, and harnessing its full potential, thus leading to an examination of their available resources? And lastly, elaborating a bit further about their economic prowess, allowing for the creation of these emblems of prosperity, as we'll call them. How might this economic powerhouse be directly linked with the extraordinary accomplishments across all the arts and sciences? The Dutch people will be blessed with a cornucopia of wealth as a result of their labors, a prosperity that the art historian Simon Schama has called an embarrassment of riches. As we'll demonstrate, the harnessing of many factors will produce a distinctly Dutch amalgam of prosperity and refinement. I've alluded to one significant component of the Dutch success story, their ability to harness local resources. So what are we talking about? Well, their engineering skills, their genius in conquering a harsh and at times inhospitable environment prone to regular flooding through the construction of dikes and windmills. Both of these, no doubt, you recall from your school days. But let's dig deeper to see how these two feats of engineering enabled great economic advances locally, but as well allowed the Dutch to embark upon great business ventures to explore vast portions of the globe unimaginable in previous centuries. One famous hydraulic engineer, Jan Legwater, managed to reclaim much land by converting large lakes into what are known as polders. This is the Dutch term for an enclosed body of land surrounded on all sides by a dike. See the print in the lower right of your screen. A polder is cut off from outside water except through perhaps a man-made or mechanical device. How did Legwater succeed in building such polders? through the harnessing of those powerful North Sea winds via the use of windmills. Since time immemorial, Holland was a swampy, waterlogged, and below sea level terrain, uninhabitable due to regular flooding. Not to mention how grim life would have been in these years, where warmth in such damp and chilly conditions was attained from wood, chopped down from any nearby forest, or through the burning of peat. But such deforestation and desecration of the land only aided and abetted the flooding after heavy rains, when many of the small rivers traversing the swamps would then flood their banks. One notorious flood was the St. Elizabeth's flood of 1421 that destroyed some 72 villages, with untold thousands of people and cattle losing their lives to the torrent of waves overtaking their Dutch hamlets and farmsteads. It was the windmill that began to change this regular pattern of flooding. During the 15th century, the construction of small ones began in earnest, slowly lifting and removing the water to alternate locations across the Dutch landscape. These, in conjunction with the construction of dikes, were the game changers. By the dawn of the 17th century, large windmills similar to the ones appearing in the painting in the lower left sprang up across the land, and most critically, windmills kept the terrain dry, allowing for the building and expansion of towns, villages, and hamlets of all sizes, and the resulting expansion of the population base during the decades and centuries that followed. I mentioned how the harnessing of the wind, along with the building of dikes, allowed the land to be conquered, resulting in the building of new towns and cities. And notice the map shown on the left depicting the lowlands as a mighty lion. It epitomizes this confidence as the Dutch people embarked upon a new era. You'll have to take my word for it, but the map, created in the year 1617, is replete with many such new towns and cities. As the 17th century progresses, merchants with more disposable income would build houses, perhaps along a newly dug canal in one of these cities. Not only were canals a necessary addition for a city's defense, but they also served as urban transportation corridors for moving both people and goods. Consider Amsterdam for a moment, whose image of Dam Square you see in the upper right. Earlier buildings of wood were largely destroyed by a great fire of 1452, so most of the city was rebuilt and appears today in red brick. Amsterdam's population growth and new winding canals would grow continuously until the year 1660, when its growth trajectory would reach an optimum size at about 200,000 people. Amsterdam was administered confidently by a governing body known as the regents, largely drawn from the well-established merchant families of wealth rather than a king. An oligarchy, the families maintained a close network for purposes of security, making certain to arrange marriages amongst themselves for continuity and future stability. And each city had its own government and laws. Having full control over the affairs of the city, the regents of Amsterdam were surprisingly outward-looking in their concerns for infrastructure projects, ranging from canal maintenance to the establishment of almshouses for the poor, but also in the building of hospitals and churches. Notice well the photo of the Maritshuis, built in The Hague between the years 1636 and 1641 by Prince Johan Maurits, the governor of Dutch Brazil. Its architectural style, now referred to as Dutch Classical, employs a symmetrical facade, a graceful Dutch variation drawing upon Greco-Roman classicism. Like the inspired ancient buildings, we see similar utilization of columns, pilasters, the embedded columns, not to mention pediments and other ancient architectural motifs. The Dutch classical style is emblematic of the expansion and health of local economies in the 1630s, when a landowner might build such an elaborate house so proudly in the center of The Hague. An interesting comparison, however, is to consider an equivalent English gentleman of the same time period. He would probably build his stately mansion in the countryside, not in the city. But for the Dutch, land was more scarce, particularly in an area that wouldn't flood. So it was all about being an urban dweller, and let's say an urbane urban dweller. Notice also the rather tall and narrow townhouses visible in the upper left of the painting of Amsterdam's Dam Square. You might wonder why the Dutch preferred such narrow houses, some of which might reach 5 to 7 stories in height if you were among the wealthiest urban dwellers. The reason? Taxes. You were assessed a property tax based upon the width of your frontage upon the canal, so it made most sense to build upwards. Today, the Maurits House shown here serves as a government-run museum, housing the Royal Cabinet of Paintings, an important collection of almost 900 objects, most of which are paintings of the Golden Age. Among its holdings are works by Rembrandt, including one of his self-portraits, but also the famous work by Vermeer that many of you know, The Girl with a Pearl Earring. One such painting from the Maurits House collection is the Rembrandt shown in the lower right, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulip, that we'll turn to in a moment. But first, we must ask, how might the 3 paintings shown here reflect the importance of the Dutch people, wholly responsible for fueling their dynamic prosperity? Let's start with the painting in the upper right, showing the magnificent interior of the Laurenskerk, a Rotterdam church that would eventually become Calvinist after the first Dutch provinces were liberated in 1572. We first need to ask, who were the Calvinists? Recall it was William of Orange, a convert to Calvinism, who led the revolt against Catholic Spain that precipitated the 80 Years' War. The Calvinists would adopt a position of accepting outsiders, especially those victims of religious persecution, such as other Protestants and Jews. So toleration was at the core of Dutch independence. So it's in this spirit that Holland became a magnet for thinkers, philosophers, scientists, eager to pursue their intellectual calling. And such an environment celebrated both a freedom of expression, but also a freedom of speculation, without fear of reprisal or recrimination from the Roman Catholic Church. As often happens in history, a confident society with a prosperous economy supports and attracts both the curious and adventuresome, eager to test their ideas, and as well hone their skills. An open-minded society accepts diversity, serving as willing participants in patronizing both unusual projects and their innovative designs. Holland in the 17th century will be no exception. Learned thinkers, scientists, and academics would be drawn to places like the University of Leiden, founded in the previous century by William of Orange, as a token of gratitude for that city's skillful and vital resistance against Spain during the 80 Years' War. Among such learned thinkers of the day will be the French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes, who will spend 21 years of his life in Holland, publishing his most important work in both Leiden and Amsterdam. Among other philosophers settling in Holland for both protection and inspiration were John Locke and Baruch Spinoza. Holland also boasted a higher literacy rate when compared with neighboring countries, and writers will also thrive in such a Dutch climate of tolerance and experimentation. Moreover, the Netherlands will become the European haven for publishing houses. Now books deemed controversial in other parts of Europe, books on religion, philosophy, and the sciences, would be printed here for clandestine export elsewhere. Scientific advances underway in Holland in the 17th century included work in the fields of astronomy, optics, and microbiology. One such astronomer and physicist, Christian Huygens, who will not only advance our understanding of Saturn's planetary rings, but he'll also invent the pendulum clock, an important step towards exactitude in timekeeping. So with that as background, we turn to the painting on the left, titled The Astronomer by Gerard Douw. The artist was a pupil of Rembrandt's and known for his intimate genre scenes where people seem deeply immersed in their everyday activities, seemingly unaware of us, the viewer. Douw's love of candlelight for dramatic focus upon facial expressions or objects on display not only produces a resulting warmth and elegance in his portraits, but creates an almost religious solemnity. Here the astronomer gazes upwards towards the heavens in a pious, devotional manner ascribed to a saint or another religious figure. He appears cloistered, like a monk, working in solitary confinement, deeply engrossed in tackling the perplexing questions before him. Dou's painting demonstrates this inquisitive world of scientific exploration, but also demands of his 17th century viewers the need to question the world around them and their place in the greater cosmos beyond. Another demonstration of this inquisitiveness, this Dutch interest in probing the depths of the world inapparent to most of us, is seen in the painting in the lower right, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp. It further suggests not only the wealth of Amsterdam, but the curious nature of her citizenry. But first, a bit of background, and it's unusual. Every 5 to 10 years, members of the local anatomists' guild would commission an artist to produce a group portrait. A young 26-year-old newly arrived in Amsterdam Rembrandt would accept the assignment in 1632. The ritual he portrayed was an annual event in which an autopsy was performed, open to the public, involving the body of a recently executed prisoner. We know the name of the prisoner, the day he'd been convicted of armed robbery, and later the date that he was sentenced to death by hanging. Having been executed that morning, he's now laid before us during his autopsy on this date in late January 1632. Surviving records indicate that different anatomists would pay to be included in the painting. With Dr. Tulp, the official city anatomist, he'd pay even more, perhaps twice as much, for his position in this starring role. But for our purposes, what does the painting and its story tell us about a society in which curiosity about the medical sciences, the ritual of an annual public autopsy, and the sitters willing to pay a substantial inclusion fee just for the privilege to participate in such an annual event? Such components reflect citizens with disposable wealth, learned organizations patronizing artists to document their affairs, while members of the general public eager to learn more about the nature of their fellow citizens' professional work. And in this instance, see the unseen, the nature of scientific discovery and the mysteries of human anatomy revealed during the annual public autopsy day. So once more, these three paintings showcase different dimensions about the Dutch people, the nature of their society, and how open-mindedness, wealth, and curiosity about their world all fuel their prosperity. We've talked a fair amount about the economics associated with the Dutch East India Company and their expanding interests that would monopolize the spice trade. However, we need to add a few more inventions that reflect upon Dutch genius, allowing for significant economic advances during their golden age. First, let's turn to the Dutch advances in the design of the sawmill. Although it had its beginnings elsewhere, it was a Dutchman by the name of Cornelius Corneliusson who invented a special type of sawmill by attaching a pitman arm, a lever-like device, to a windmill. He patented his invention in 1593, building his first sawmill the following year and his pitman attachment 4 years later. So why is this so important to our story? This water-powered sawmill allowed for greater advances in the shipbuilding industry, just at a time when the VOC was in its infancy. Note the image of the Amsterdam shipyard shown on the left. As the early decades of the century progressed, Holland would produce more ships more efficiently, vessels used for ocean-going cargo, but others for military use as well. The wood was oak from the forests of Poland, and some 4,000 planks were required for each ship, which, by the way, would last for only 1 or 2 voyages before rotting, falling apart, and getting replaced. So not only were the Dutch trading on the world stage, but within Europe as well. Let's call it fortuitous geographic positioning. Their north-south to east-west location meant they could serve as intermediaries for moving wine from France and Portugal in the south, for example, to various Baltic regions in the north. Then for the reverse journey, cargo ships carrying grains from the north towards any number of final destinations throughout southern Europe. Moreover, and another important dimension to the Dutch economic story, the establishment of the Bank of Amsterdam in 1609, which would become the precursor to the world's first central bank. I might also mention the special and early relationship between the Dutch and the Japanese. The Netherlands held a monopoly over the country. They were allowed to have an island base in the harbor at Nagasaki from the late 1630s onwards. Usually 2 ships arrived there each year with much attending fanfare overseen by the VOC's permanent staff of the 10 employees serving their Dutch director. Recall I mentioned the VOC as the forerunners for offering shares to attract shareholders and managing to pay an annual dividend of 18% for almost 200 years? Thus the economic engines were aggressively aiding and abetting the creation of wealth as the Golden Age prosperity grew through the 17th century. Let's also turn to another artistic emblem of Dutch prosperity. Note the famous portrait by Rembrandt in the lower right, his sampling officials of the Drapers' Guild, sometimes referred to as the syndics of the Drapers' Guild, dating to the year 1662. Such Rembrandt portraits of Amsterdam's men of commerce have come to epitomize Dutchmen of wealth wearing black satin suits adorned with ruffled lace collars, some sporting wide-brimmed hats as well. And yes, Dutchmen actually dressed like dandies. But you might also wonder, why does this painting look so familiar? Perhaps it's your childhood memory of a brand of cigar called Dutch Masters that would reproduce the painting on their cigar boxes and appropriate the image for print advertisements and television commercials as well. The marketing gurus seized upon the dignified grandeur of the Drapers' Guild of Amsterdam, whose elegant panache and unspoken demeanor still speak to us in whispers down the ages. Such men still exude and epitomize economic success well into the 20th century. I've mentioned how the economic prosperity resulted in the growth of cities, especially Amsterdam. But we might consider another Dutch city, the city of Delft, as emblematic of prosperity. 2 particular emblems shown here draw us closer. The city's renowned blue and white porcelain that was meant to imitate, if not rival, similar wares imported by the VOC from China, also the work of one of Delft's native sons, the artist Johannes Vermeer. His artistic output of only 36 paintings offers insight into the wealth and prosperity of his hometown, a city in which Vermeer appears to have spent his entire career. First notice Vermeer's riverfront landscape, in which Delft is bathed in the soft northern European light. Even today, it provokes contemplation as we reflect upon the seemingly timeless calm and tranquility reflecting the Dutch Golden Age. I might add that such paintings of an urban landscape like this were rare in the mid-17th century. Vermeer's seemingly frozen-in-time landscape is similar in mood to his sumptuous interiors where people transact their own private, everyday activities. Sometimes their interiors are flush with trinkets, mementos, and baubles, some even acquired for investment purposes. Often, such objects were kept in glass-sided curiosity cabinets, as they were called, housing exotic rhino horns or coral spoons, Roman coins, telescopes, microscopes, even ostrich eggs. Their homes, in the end, appear more akin to a museum than a private residence. In documenting such urbane and sophisticated settings, Vermeer allows us entree into the lives of these elegantly dressed men and women and their surroundings. Turning to one such evocative portrait titled The Geographer, it's thought to depict another of Delft's native sons, the scientist and microbiologist Antoine van Leeuwenhoek. He used hand-ground lenses for studying microbial life and was the first scientist to describe bacteria. Once more, we witness an almost ethereal light, gently bathing all components in this otherworldly serenity of the Golden Age. Vermeer portrays him as the polymath, the curious man of the world, donning a Japanese-style robe popular among scholars of his day. Recall that special relationship between the VOC and Japan during the 17th century. The globe, perched on the shelf overhead, is by a well-known Amsterdam maker of globes named Hondius. It's no accident that the globe shows the Indian Ocean, the successful pathway for the seemingly endless generation of wealth by the Dutch East India Company. Lastly, we turn to the blue and white ceramics of Delft. Recall the wealthy weren't only interested in acquiring exotic spices, but also other Far Eastern luxury goods, and only the most wealthy of the Dutch could afford Chinese porcelain. But it was the entrepreneurial Dutch who seized upon a strategic entry point for developing their own blue and white when they recognized the interruption of Chinese porcelain imports following the death of one of the Chinese emperors in 1620. At first, their Delft wares were poor imitations, not as thin or finely decorated in blue patterning, but over time, they'd eventually perfect both technique and design. And we see three examples of what might be called quintessential Dutch designs. The well-known Delft tile depicts a genre scene. Today, many Dutch houses still use tiles like these dating back to the 17th and 18th centuries. Also in the lower right, two examples of dinnerware, each laden with figurative and geometric patterning, imitating their Chinese prototypes. However, many such wares would now include Dutch motifs of windmills and fishing boats or representative landscapes or seascapes. However, one plate in the lower right portrays a Japanese scene, suitable for the cosmopolitan collector eager to boast of his or her worldliness and perhaps knowledge of this special relationship with Japan. But the piece de resistance, shown in the upper center, is the tulip vase. I mean, how much more Dutch can we get? The blue and white porcelain vase was designed to hold long-stemmed tulips, prone to bending over after a few days indoors, but now suitably supported, hopefully for longer periods of enjoyment. The Dutch genius once more has raised its clever head. Speaking of tulips, we all recognize their important role as colorful harbingers of spring after a long and perhaps dreary winter. But how might the beloved tulip be the most recognizable emblem of Dutch prosperity? First, let's consider for a moment the following words and phrases: irrational love, rare and exotic bulbs, frenzy coupled with much disposable income. I think you know where this story is going. Certainly among the first of the speculative bubbles in economic history, you can see within the graph in the upper right the exponential rise of bulb prices until their sudden collapse in February of 1637. But let's put all this into context. In the center of your screen, you see a catalog of 1637, the sought-after wish list for any gardener envisioning a colorful flower bed come spring. In the catalog appeared one such prized bulb, the Semper Augustus. On the left, you see a watercolor of this exotic gem, whose bulb price rose to become the most expensive on the market in 1636 to 37. Today, such so-called parrot tulips, like the Semper Augustus, are distinguished by their striated, almost flame-like bands of irregular color. However, the 17th century Dutch hadn't known or realized that such distinctive coloration was the result of a virus, causing further irregular variations from one bulb to the next. On the right as well is another gem, the Viceroy, whose bulb was offered for between 3,000 and 4,200 florins. Now, this was some 10 to 12 times the annual salary of a skilled craftsperson in the year 1637. However, most modern scholars view the tulip craze as more of a socio-cultural event, like a fad gone mad, and less of an economic event. It was just a race for a luxury good, a want or a must-have, and not a necessity. After all, Holland had the highest per capita income of any country in the world during these years of the 17th century, and her citizens were certainly flush with disposable income. So yes, tulip mania might be seen as the world's first stock market crash, but it didn't have lasting ramifications. And for us, this bursting of the tulip bubble and market crash is amongst the earliest demonstrations of what Alan Greenspan, the Federal Reserve Chairman, would call irrational exuberance. And, as you know, it's only in hindsight that rationality prevails, as the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s and other episodes have demonstrated, sometimes painfully. The grand painting of a banquet shown here celebrates what most would identify as a justified, rational exuberance, the end of the long war between Spain and the Netherlands. More specifically, the Treaty of Münster, signed on January 30th, 1648, also ended the 30 Years' War, as this subchapter at the end of the 80 Years' War was known. The celebratory banquet held in June of that year by the Crossbowmen's Guild of Amsterdam resulted in a commission for this painting to decorate their dining hall. Such a banquet would probably have lasted 5 hours or more, with much alcohol consumed. Not only domestic but imported beer, wine from France and the Rhone Valley, along with spirits. It's said that each celebrant might consume 50 large glasses in an evening, or perhaps 10 large drinks an hour. Note the captains of the Civic Guard Company proudly shaking hands on the right. Also a bit of drink playfully passed around the room via a drinking horn, no doubt a preamble to all the drink to follow. The artist has also included a poem written on the drum that you see in the lower center, stating that the city's weapons shall be laid to rest. With the Treaty of Münster, there was now a definitive recognition of the country's sovereignty. Like all joyous celebrations at the conclusion of a lengthy and costly war, it's grounds for merriment indeed, with many toasts raised, all in the hope of peaceful prosperity to follow for many years to come. We might now turn to yet another demonstration of rationality, or irrationality perhaps, seen through a revisit to the New World. More specifically, in consideration of the Dutch trading post on the island of Manhattan. Recall Henry Hudson would so-called discover this portion of southern New York, claiming it for the Dutch government. But turning to the other side of the world for a moment, the British would acquire ownership of a small island called Run, located within the Banda Island group of the Spice Islands today in Indonesia. Note its place within the map in the upper right. Run Island was prized for its nutmeg, whose trees were then found only on the Banda Islands. As the most expensive commodity of its day after gold and silver, nutmeg could command a markup of some 60,000% when comparing its price in the Spice Islands with its market value in Europe. Its main uses, it was not only a preservative, but also used as a medicine, believed to ward off the plague. As background, the British had secured Run under the English East India Company, but were never really good at defending it, and the Dutch managed to take it over, and despite the end of the First Anglo-Dutch War of the 1650s, in which the Dutch were to return Run Island to the British, it never happened. And it was after the Second Anglo-Dutch War in the 1660s, the following decade, the two countries agreed to a swap. So Britain would get the island of New Amsterdam, later known as Manhattan, and the Dutch were to hold on to the island of Run in perpetuity. Ironically, as history would have it, the available markets for growing the valuable spices such as cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and others would expand. A French missionary, for example, had smuggled out nutmeg seedlings, and they were eventually planted on Madagascar, Mauritius, and Zanzibar. And the British, too, transplanted seedlings to other places, such as Ceylon in India, all allowing for the eventual breakup of the Dutch spice monopoly. You see on the screen two early depictions of New Amsterdam, Manhattan, during the 1660s. largely undeveloped and pastoral, as the image in the lower right suggests. And note as well in the lower left the prospect of early urban planning before the fully realized grid pattern would overtake most of the island. By the way, we also need to put to rest what might be the first urban legend in American history. This notion that the Dutch acquired Manhattan Island from the local Native Americans for $24 worth of beads and trinkets? Pure poppycock. Neither a deed of land transfer nor formal bill of sale has surfaced to prove such a transaction. Yet, indeed, it did make for a very good story to engage a child's interest in history, didn't it? But in the end, let's ponder for a moment this transfer of islands between the Dutch and the British. Manhattan or Rhun Island? Rhun Island or Manhattan? I'll let you draw your own conclusion as to whether the British or the Dutch came out ahead. And while neither Britain nor Holland are in possession of either island, think for a moment how these islands on opposite sides of the world could possibly have ever been put into an equation, each on the side of an equal sign set between them. Manhattan equals Rhun Island? How history indeed reappraises equivalency. During the 18th century, Dutch hegemony on the world stage would wane, her economic power increasingly overshadowed by her larger and more predominant European neighbors, France and Great Britain. Now we turn our attention to the early and mid-19th century, when various portions of the Netherlands will be united. Later in the century, the rise of Germany will become increasingly important. Dutch history will be more than a story of economic history, and her influence will be in evidence in many other ways in the 20th century. The creation of present-day Netherlands as we know her evolved in stages, stemming from the collapse of Napoleon and his power between 1813 and 15. And the two key figures shown here will play significant roles in our story. On the left, note the commanding full-length portrait of King William I. But we need to go back chronologically for a moment, as he would first declare himself the sovereign prince of the United Netherlands in 1813, and 2 years later, feeling threatened by Napoleon's escape from Elba in 1815, he would go on to declare himself King of the Netherlands and Duke of Luxembourg. However, the country wouldn't become an independent entity until 1839. And this was the same year that modern-day Luxembourg was founded. On the right, you see a portrait of Johann Rudolf Thorbecke, perhaps the most influential Dutch statesman of the 19th century. In the year 1848, when much of Europe was in turmoil, if not unrest, the king solicited Thorbecke to rewrite the Dutch constitution. As the key architect of essentially a constitutional monarchy, he foresaw the need to shift power away from the king while granting more to the States General. Thus, the ruling cabinet was beholden only to the elected members of parliament and not the king. Thorbecke's constitution also focused on the needs of the people, guaranteeing key religious and political freedoms previously marginalized in earlier versions of the Constitution. So thus, these two men, although a generation apart, played fundamental roles in establishing and navigating Dutch independence and carving out a path forward for a secure Netherlands. During the First World War, the Netherlands declared herself a neutral country and was largely isolated from its horrors. Spared of trench warfare and the newly utilized tanks, machine guns, and aerial bombardment, not to mention the extraordinary loss of life, however, with the influx of some 1 million Belgian refugees in 1914 to 15, food supplies ran short as the war progressed. So Holland wasn't entirely immune from hardship between 1914 and 18. But moving to the years after the Great Depression, a sad and similar fate befell the Netherlands that would grip many of her European neighbors. In the spring of 1940, Nazi Germany invaded. Although the Netherlands had declared neutrality when war first broke out in 1939, as they had done similarly in 1914, Adolf Hitler took no notice and invaded Holland anyway, and on May 10, 1940, just a month after they had invaded Norway, the Germans arrived. On this day, May 10th, the Third Reich made a powerful push. Along with the Netherlands, 3 other countries, Luxembourg, Belgium, and France, were also invaded. In just 6 weeks, significant portions of all 3 had fallen to the Third Reich. Note the photograph in the upper left of the screen. This was the aftermath of the aerial bombardment of Rotterdam, Holland's second largest city, on May 14th, just 4 days after the Germans had arrived in the country. Not only were most of Rotterdam's buildings destroyed, the bombing left some 78,000 homeless and resulted in the deaths of 800 civilians. The vicious attack was so early in the German advance that the ill-equipped Dutch forces had no choice but to surrender the following day. As would happen in many areas of German-occupied Europe, the Jewish population would eventually be rounded up and sent to concentration camps. After the war, incredible acts of heroism would emerge, along with stories fraught with sadness, if not terror. You can recall the story of the adolescent girl Anne Frank, whose family fled to Holland from Nazi Germany when she was only 4.5 years old. She and her family then spent a number of years hiding from authorities in Amsterdam. Both Anne and her sister were sent to Auschwitz, eventually moved to Bergen-Belsen, where she would die just prior to the liberation of that camp in May 1945. Scholars estimate that some 70% of the Dutch Jewish population lost their lives, a higher percentage than in the other German-occupied countries of Belgium or France. The German imprint upon the Dutch people was everywhere. Note the recruitment poster for the Dutch SS shown in the center. Such posters would seduce several thousand young Dutch men to serve in combat roles on the Russian front. Also note the German government issued Dutch ID papers like the one shown in the lower left, also the ration coupon book shown in the upper center. There was an underground resistance movement, small in the actual number of participants, yet a movement that grew in number as the occupation and the war dragged on. Note one of their newspapers, Ons Volk, shown in the lower right. It wasn't until May 5, 1945, when the entire Republic of the Netherlands was free once more. The emotions of the Dutch women in the photo in the upper right, gleefully greeting and welcoming their Canadian liberators, say it all. This was nearly 5 years to the day since the Germans had arrived. Modern observers clearly recognize the professionalism, the outward-looking and confident disposition of the Dutch, pervasive in the years following the Second World War. On the screen, you see many emblematic representations of European progress to carve out a new sense of purpose, of peace and order, following so much warfare and disorder of the first half of the 20th century. The Dutch will be integral members in the search for peaceful solutions to bind and integrate Europe, embracing strategic, economic, and political endeavors after 1945. As a founding member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, the Dutch also followed by becoming a founding member of the ESCS, the European Coal and Steel Community, 3 years later, in 1952. This organization was a precursor to the foundation of the EEC, the European Economic Community. Note the map on the left outlining those first members of the EEC in 1957, shown here in lavender. Once more, the Netherlands was one of its charter members. The EEC would later expand, becoming the EU, the European Union. At the end of the century, in 1999, the Netherlands would be a founding member of the Euroband currency group that will adopt the euro as the standard currency now used by 23 European nations. The Netherlands is also home to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, shown in the lower right. The esteemed body is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, settling legal disputes among member states while also issuing advisories for its specialized agencies. Its panel of 15 judges are elected by the UN General Assembly, and each judge serves a 9-year term. The Hague was chosen by the UN because of the Peace Palace, shown here, which opened in 1913. Ironically, in August of 1913, exactly 12 months before the start of the First World War. Our lectures on Dutch history have spanned some 2,000 years, beginning with the early settlements of the Romans and the Vikings. The Dutch would demonstrate their prowess at problem solving in controlling their flood-prone landscape, some of it below sea level, through the use of dikes and windmills. Their use of sawmills created efficiencies in the shipbuilding industry, allowing for the expansion of the local economy, but also the creation for what would become the economic powerhouse of the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company. The VOC would be pioneering in business history, attracting shareholders and issuing bonds, also precipitating the development of the Bank of Amsterdam as the precursor to the world's first central bank. Following the Dutch revolt and banishing the shackles of Catholic Spain, Holland would expand her presence on the world stage, not only as economic traders, but as a European colonial power as well. The 17th century, as we've seen, truly was a Dutch century, whose golden age emblems of prosperity continue to draw our love and admiration, not only during visits to Holland, but in museum exhibits throughout the world. We also acknowledged modern Holland's role in creating a post-Second World War Europe, both before and after the creation of the European Union. This phrase, founding member, kept coming up time and again. In conclusion, I might address a concern the world over as the 21st century unfolds. The dire forecasts associated with rising sea temperatures and the potential for flooding that could overwhelm many coastal regions around the world, the Netherlands included. Legitimate concerns have been raised about the current Dutch flood control systems and whether they'll still be viable in the coming decades. If anything might be gleaned from these lectures, it's the Dutch ability to solve problems using both skills and creativity with just the right amount of pluck to get themselves out of most any adversity. And they will probably be the creative masters in finding solutions to help others throughout the world as well. And with history on their side, I have no doubt they will succeed. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Charles Doherty, Chief Resident Historian for Viking Cruises. And we find ourselves today looking at Dutch history, part 2. Hopefully you've been able to enjoy this lecture just now. And I know that you have many questions that have been coming in, and I look forward to the opportunity to answer them. But I thought by way of introduction, before I get to a few questions from last week, I would mention how Karina Hagen does this great little video each weekend in which she anticipates and introduces what will be in store on live Viking TV in the upcoming week. And I'm really looking forward to the program tomorrow with Cecil, our wonderful Norwegian opera star, who will be doing a session from her farm in Norway, doing a little bit of singing as well. And for those of you who didn't have a chance to catch her performance last week in association with Norwegian National Day, would highly recommend visiting and enjoying it as well. And there's a great session, that's tomorrow, and there's a great session then on Thursday as well with Lida Kruger, an amazing story, documentary, and I would highly recommend that one as well. But as a little bit of a lead-in, in this episode of Karina's overview of the week, she mentioned about coming upon a snail, the wonders of a little snail who blessed her path as she returned home with the 2 dogs after a swim in the local lake. And I mentioned, James, if you could then pull up the first image here. I brought in for us a reminder of the Dutch still life painting tradition, which hopefully you can see on your screen. This is a painting called Vase of Flowers, done around the year 1660, today in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And I didn't mention this genre of painting, but an important one in which one could contemplate and reflect upon not just the brevity of life, all of the sense of mortality, but in the lower left-hand corner, James has captured for us an image of a snail. Again, how a snail but the butterflies and all of the creatures and critters that would be infused in a part of such a still life painting. All of these help to remind us, like a memento mori painting, those paintings that have a skull. All of us will be a part of that ashes to ashes, dust to dust lifestyle. And in those flowers, you'd find such little critters. And you'd find flowers that would be, let's say, but in the stage of buds, others that would be in full bloom, others that were perhaps a bit past their prime, petals that had fallen to the table below. So by way of introduction here, I raided my garden, and I only got through my backyard. If I just may put these, James, if you want to come back to us live. You can see a variety of different flowers. I've chosen everything from an orange rhododendron in celebration of the Netherlands, but as well there's an azalea, 2 different kinds of tree peonies, 3 other kinds of peonies, 3 different colors of lilac, iris, lily of the valley. You get the idea. And I brought this in again to celebrate this sense of how and why the bounty of the earth was such a key part of the celebratory nature of 17th century Holland and the Netherlands. Well, let me just put these back here before I tip them over. And then let's start out by looking at some of those questions. Again, a couple from last week. One of you had mentioned, again, I'm Billy in Eckworth, had last week asked the question, how did William of Orange come to power in the Netherlands? And it's interesting when you can reflect upon the fact that he had been a Prince of Orange. He had been from a landed gentry family. He had been essentially titled with different states, portions of the unfounded lands that would become the Netherlands. And so he would have been well educated. He would have been at the right place at the right time to serve this critical role. Part diplomat, part leader, part military, he was skilled in all of these areas. And so he was at the right place at the right time. And I think it was those last 8 or 9 years of his life, and in particular, he served that diplomatic role, being the glue to bring together different factions that were so critically important in anticipation of the Dutch revolt. Janet from Evanston last week had asked a question which I hadn't fully understood the nature of the question, and I answered a different one. She had asked about which languages were spoken by early settlers. And because I had been reading this book the night before, I had thought about early settlers and jumped to the conclusion that she was addressing those coming to the New World, to North America, and I mentioned something about early grammars and dictionaries for communicating with the Native Americans. But in reality, she was asking a question, a very good one, about what early languages were spoken by those early people in what would later become the Netherlands, after the era of the Romans. And what's so interesting is that I noticed that there was another question that was also asked here. Similarly, Barbara from Leesburg had asked, how did the Dutch language develop? And again, trying to merge these two questions, there were really some early Germanic languages associated with those tribes of those people involved with the migration period. The Eastern European Ostrogoths spoke a language called Gothic, which is now lost to us. but known through a translation of the Bible. And I think there is also some runic inscriptions in Denmark that have the Gothic script. But the West German peoples from, let's say, the 4th to the 8th, 9th centuries in there would have spoken what was Old Frankish. And that language would evolve then, Barbara, to Old Dutch. And for our purposes, again, just the brevity of this, for those of you interested in learning more about some of these early languages, just Google Old Dutch or Old Frankish, and you will find much more about how it would evolve, I think, into what was known as Middle Dutch in the 11th century, and again, then eventually becoming the language, the Dutch language as we know it today. Well, just turning to some other questions here. Peter in Baton Rouge had mentioned, says, you mentioned a Rembrandt self-portrait in an earlier lecture. How many of them are there? I think that Rembrandt reference came up in the Italian Renaissance lecture, if I recall. And it was about one of his self-portraits that was hanging in the Vasari corridor of the Uffizi in Florence. Well, Peter, it's interesting how, yes, there are many, perhaps as many as 100. I think maybe 30 or 40 some in paint. The others are in etching and as well in drawings. And scholars still debate how many might actually be self-portraits by Rembrandt as opposed to maybe some students, people in his workshop that were copying the image and his likeness. And so some of them, again, they're not certain if they are of his hand. But what is interesting about how or why an artist over the course of, well, he was productive from his early 20s up until his death. I think he died at age 63 or thereabouts. The fact that we have this chronology, this personal benchmark of how he aged over the decades, which is fascinating in itself. And, how and why you would do this, remember one's likeness, and these would have been done with a mirror, painting from, looking at oneself in a mirror or drawing or etching, that they would have provided the most easy sitter, the most likely person to, practice expressions or different kinds of guise. There's a famous one of Rembrandt in kind of Turkish garb, associated with the Ottoman Empire, looking like a sultan, that kind of thing. And it's kind of uncanny for us now looking back at it that, yes, there were self-portraits done by previous artists. There's one of Raphael, for example, in the far right-hand portion of the composition of the School of Athens, that cycle for the papal apartments in the Vatican. Raphael included himself in his likeness. But to have this body of, what is purportedly between 80 and 100 widely recognized self-portraits is quite remarkable, and something that then artists for centuries thereafter would continue to use their likeness in the nature and of their work. Great question. Just turning to another one. Thinking about the Rembrandt again, I just lost the person that was asking this, but this was Lisa in London, sorry. Could you speak more about Rembrandt and why he's so important? Whoa, Lisa, if you probably asked 50 art historians that question, you might get 20 variations on a theme. If I could just attempt to tackle it, remember, we could have a whole graduate seminar or nothing but Rembrandt. But let's start with the beginning. First of all, I alluded to the fact that he was painting for many years, 40 some years, from his early 20s into his early 60s. He was also embracing, as I mentioned, different media, working in oil, doing etchings, working in printmaking, but as well, he was a draftsman in terms of the drawings that he left to us. But that it's not just the amount that he left us and the variety of media, but it's also the fact that he was taking in and learning and evolving as he went along, borrowing things from Italy, from the Italian Baroque. Those of you familiar with the artist Caravaggio, who was known for his dramatic kind of stage lighting, the chiaroscuro was the art historical term for that light and dark. So he was playing with that idea of dramatic lighting, but also then learning about the layering of paint and creating this kind of inner glow and this warmth and this magic that would happen in the complexions of his figures. And he was also doing not just portraiture, as we did shown as we used some of his examples in the lecture, but also the fact that there were biblical scenes and mythological scenes and characters that looked like real people. And there was something about capturing the essence of emotion and real people that brought these stories to life in a new way. And again, we have to mention this idea of the psychological, how so important it was for this inner glow to communicate some sort of discord or stress or danger or joy that seems to emanate from the figures that he was painting. That famous painting, The Night Watch, which many of you can picture, a colossal painting. I can't remember. It's like 12 by 14 feet in dimension, high and wide. And that painting again is kind of magical because it shows not just all of that dramatic lighting that I referred to, not just the idea of the psychological moment, but it was so different from other traditional group portraits, if you will, like some of those I showed you, like the Syndics of the Cloth Guild, the one of the Dutch masters. An art historian or art critic once wrote about how the Night Watch looked like the gathering of people for the class photo before they got into place, whereas the Syndics of the Cloth Guild is the official portrait where everyone's in place, composed, directed, hold that pose, click, and you capture the image. So it was that sense of the momentary and the action and the non-traditional way that Rembrandt was oftentimes, composing his works. All of those things make for him to be such an important artist, let alone his legacy. You have to remember that for centuries after, artists have oftentimes gone back to look at Rembrandt, his technique, how he was so successful. And we have to remember that the Romantic period, late 18th, early 19th centuries, the Romantic artists will be very much inspired and influenced by the work of Rembrandt. I just noticed out the window here, when James and I were setting up, there was a dramatic thunderstorm that was very black, and the sky in this room was very darkened. And obviously the clouds have cleared, so now I kind of have that glow, if you will, of after the storm. Sorry about that. And as I've mentioned before, these are done spontaneously. There's no script. We just do this conversationally. Similarly, last week, one of you had mentioned the fact that I alluded to Queen Victoria, who happened to be responsible after the Spanish Armada in signing off for the British East India Company. All historians know that Elizabethan England is associated with the 16th century, Victorian of the 19th. Sorry about that. And again, the same way, when we talk about Elizabethan England, we're usually talking about the 16th century, not our present glorious Queen Elizabeth II, who would have ever imagined? We would have thought that the 20th century would have been associated with her reign. Little did we know it would span into the 21st century. A remarkable woman, long may she reign, but usually Elizabethan England is associated with the 16th century. But let me see what other questions I can come up with here for you. Liz in Bakersfield, hello Liz, asks, why are there only 36 Vermeers? Again, we don't have a definitive answer for that. And like so many situations whereby somebody's important and then you have forgeries or you have people that are copying, scholars still think that he may have only produced something in the neighborhood of 50, at most 80 paintings in his entire life, his entire career. And you might be wondering, well, why didn't he produce more? And especially when we talk about artists like Rembrandt or Frans Hals, who were so prolific, producing hundreds of paintings. And some of the Dutch marine painters would have done 1,000 paintings. So what is it about Vermeer that scholars are kind of wondering why aren't there more? Well, in the first place, Vermeer's technique was such that he was very precise. He was very concerned. One almost wonders if he was kind of a meditative, contemplative painter who was really thinking deeply about the strokes and about the nuance and the impression, the resulting impression from the colors and the light and these sorts of things. We also know by use of X-rays on Vermeer paintings that there are a variety of different changes compositionally, also in terms of the application of paint and the details that he would change over time. So they think that he may have only painted perhaps 2-3 paintings a year as opposed to just churning them out. And you also might wonder then, well, why is that? Well, it may be that his, very technical approach, and again, the compositions are carefully worked out. And there was a camera obscura, which is a kind of an early visual camera device upon which he would work to then get the geometry and the proportions and the kind of raking light just right. So he was using kind of scientific principles as well as just his imagination for documenting these interior spaces. But another component to this is the fact that it may have just been about supply and demand, that there were so many artists flourishing in 17th century Holland that there may not have been as many patrons or clients, or the demand for these sorts of paintings that were so nuanced and so complex and so beautifully, skillfully rendered, that maybe there was just not the need because of the lack of demand to produce more. But it's a fascinating question. And I'll come back at the end of today's talk with just a painting that indicates the legacy of Vermeer as we then continually assess not just his life, but as well his output. Let's see what else we can come up with. Okay, this is a question from Maggie in San Francisco. On a school trip to Holland in the 1960s, it was explained to us that the Dutch sent all their butter for export. This self-sacrifice greatly impressed us at the time. Was it true? And if so, what was it all about? That's one of those, Maggie, questions. I have to say, I don't know about Dutch export of butter. I know that, for example, the export of New Zealand butter was critically important at different times during the New Zealand economy, but I don't know about the 1960s in Holland. Here's John in Holland, Michigan. Of course, you can imagine what topic he may address. Could you please touch upon the hunger winter of 44-45 when tulip bulbs became a food source? I can't speak specifically about the hunger winter of 44-45, but in terms of specifically in Holland. But remember that was the horrific winter of the Battle of the Bulge. Yesterday in America was Memorial Day. And just recently, of course, all across Europe was celebrated VE Day, the day of the end of the occupation, German occupation in so many of those European countries. And from a personal standpoint, I've been thinking about this myself because my father was at the Battle of the Bulge, survived, but was in Paris on VE Day. And again, he's not with us, has been gone for a number of years, but I just wish I could ask more questions about what that was like to be a 22-year-old GI in Paris on VE Day. So, John, I'm sorry I don't know specifics about the Hunger Winter, but it was a devastatingly difficult winter, not only for the advance of military forces in eastern Belgium, but as well the food shortages that had been crippling so much of the population of those occupied countries by that end of the war. Because remember, that was some 4.5 years into the German occupation. Al in Pleasanton, California, has just written in asking, does the government presumably Dutch government, have a plan for severe potential flooding that you mentioned? Yes, they are working on this, and I think I hopefully try to establish it. They're working on this not just for themselves and thinking about solving problems locally, but addressing the problem internationally. How island communities, how various lands that are so close to sea level or below, how they might deal with these uncertainties of rising seawater temperatures, rising sea levels, again, that I think that is indeed a work in progress. David in Franklin asks, the extent of Dutch neutrality in the early stages of World War II. Interesting one. Just to back up a bit, remember they had declared their neutrality in the First World War with limited success. But what happened with the Second World War is the fact that they had declared neutrality. Germany took no notice. And then in May of 1940, as they were advancing, the Germans were advancing not through just Norway, but as well so many other mainland European countries. That assault Rotterdam was just far, far too dramatic, and the Dutch were so ill-equipped that neutrality again stood for less than a year. So again, we all kind of look back at and make sense of and put together the pieces of these puzzles about not just complicity, but as well how things progressed in ways sometimes far unpredictable. And again, I guess it's true in this day and age too, but what's on a piece of paper or what someone sells, doesn't necessarily mean that much if you have evil forces intent on their own agendas. Jim in St. Louis asks, population of the Netherlands beginning, middle, and golden era. Oh, well, I can attempt that one, Jim. The population at around 1600, the beginning of the 17th century, was about 1.5 million people in all the Netherlands. And of that, I think 200,000 was in Amsterdam. And by the end of the century, if I could just use the benchmark 1700, it's estimated that there were just under 1.8 million people. So that beginning and the end would have been only a growth or expansion of less than 300,000 people. So it wasn't as if the population was really booming over that course of the Golden Age. But what I think is so important to remember is that it was becoming increasingly urbanized. And because of that dike system, the windmills, the controlling of the land, and the idea of having, canals and infrastructure in cities, this meant that the cities became much more populous, but also more attractive, as we talked about in the lecture. But the other dimension to your question, which I think should be referred to, is the fact that, little Holland, little Netherlands, if you will, was only, I think, like 35 to 40% of the population of Great Britain. but yet their GDP was some astoundingly a higher figure in relation to that of the UK. So it's not just the population size, but it's the fact that what they had and what they were doing economically was so far ahead of her neighbors. Dave in Orlando asks, why did the Dutch monopoly of the spice trade end? Well, in the lecture, I mentioned about how nutmeg was first grown or known in the Banda Islands, those spice islands of modern-day Indonesia, and that what was it? I think it was this nutmeg commanded a price 60,000% more in Europe than it did locally in Indonesia. So the markup was phenomenal, and the success was extraordinary. And that, of course, would not only be noticed by others in Europe, but would have made it attractive. And there was that French missionary who was responsible for taking some of the nutmeg seedlings. I think he took them to Madagascar, Mauritius, and Zanzibar. And it was just a matter of time before those crops were developing and made available. And also intervening here were that the First and Second Anglo-Dutch Wars. And remember, there's that period, I can't remember exactly, 9 or 12 years when the British were in control of portions of the Spice Islands. And that then led, as the lecture mentioned, about this Manhattan Transfer, as I've called it, basically the Netherlands getting the Banda Island, or the island of Run in the Banda Islands back in trade for Manhattan Island. So, and then by then, though that nutmeg crop was growing elsewhere, also in terms of what was happening in the continent, both France and Britain were assuming greater importance, not just in terms of powers within Europe, but the expansions of their own empires. The fact that the Dutch monopoly really became less and less significant, particularly since they had lost this important cash crop of nutmeg. So again, great question. We're just watching our time here. I don't have that much time. Let's see if we can find one more question here. But actually, I think we've done most of that. But thinking about the tulip, when John in Holland, Michigan mentioned about tulips, I thought I'd just share with you a couple stories that, again, we just didn't have time for in the lecture. And one of them was about the Viceroy tulip bulb. That there was a watercolor that was shown in the lecture. And there was a story about a man of wealth. And this is what he had paid for one tulip bulb, one Viceroy. He paid 8,000 pounds, he offered and received for the tulip bulb, 8,000 pounds of wheat, 16,000 pounds of rye, 4 oxen, 8 pigs, 12 sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 1,000 gallons of beer, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a suit of clothes, and he threw in, just to seal the deal, a silver drinking cup. Again, all of that for one Viceroy tulip bulb. The other little tidbits, the fact that as speculators were increasingly interested in growing tulips, one would release chickens, pigs, and dogs into one of your competitors' tulip fields as a means of destroying the crop and hopefully making the price of your own tulips that much more valuable that season. And there were also rumors spread about, crops being totally wiped out, and as a result, that meant that your own tulips would be more profitable. So it was a real kind of dog-eat-dog period of, exuberance beyond comparison. But again, just trying to get your mind around the fact that this is a period of people with much too much disposable wealth and this new commodity that was so sought after. And again, how in retrospect, it all sounds so terribly silly. Well, I think, again, by way of conclusion, I need to kind of go back to remembering, some of you have asked about a film, what kind of any Dutch films that might be of interest. And as we've talked about the Second World War, I chose one called Winter in Wartime from 2008. It was a Dutch film that won many awards, was very well received in Holland, and dealt with the story of a teenage Dutch boy who was responsible for helping with the Dutch resistance during the period of Nazi occupation, and in preventing or sequestering, shielding a British airman who had parachuted and landed on Dutch soil during that occupation. I won't get involved with further details of the plot, but again, that would be a good film if you wanted one while we're having these hours at home, again, called Winter in Wartime. And then I thought, by way of conclusion, I should mention the fact that this idea of legacy, and about not just aspects of Rembrandt, but Vermeer, but how Holland and Dutch Golden Age painting matters. And I brought in a painting. I thought this might be a great way to kind of summarize and pull together aspects and threads of these lectures. And James, if you could put that up for us. It's a painting by the American artist named Edward Hopper, who some of you may know his work, one called The Nighthawks, for example, which shows different diners in a kind of a corner night lit dining area. Kind of fluorescent lights seem to glow. Well, this painting that you see here from 1921 or thereabouts is called New York Interior. And why I brought this in is that, again, we talked about Vermeer capturing these interior spaces with kind of sometimes theatrical stage lighting of people involved, engrossed in some everyday activity, but as if we are voyeurs kind of peeking in on the private nature of their life at home. And why this kind of matters, or why it's interesting for us in this day of COVID-19 as we approach reality and life beyond, that this painting was done maybe 18 months, at most 2 years after the horrors of the First World War and that onslaught on the Western Front, let alone the devastation of the influenza pandemic from 1918, 1919. And as I mentioned, this painting is titled New York Interior, but it's not just about the interior space, if you will. It's about the mind of this woman who appears to be mending. Her hand is there. And you can see that an intrusion, if you will, of that black hat coming into that powder blue portion of her dress in the lower right. I mean, maybe she's a ballerina repairing one of her ballet slippers, or we don't know. But then there's also that blood red, perhaps a shawl or a throw or a coat or something in the lower left. And we get this sense of unease, and the fact that we find the documentation of her living space. Notice that Greco-Roman column that's used in two parts to support the fireplace mantle. And you know that again, we talked in that those Greco-Roman lectures about how the legacy is the symbolism of the firmament, of the the solidity, if you will, of those old democratic principles, early democracy. We find these man-made structures like those columns juxtaposed with the portrait that you see that's kind of diffuse, an ancestral portrait, reminding one of the fact that our ancestors got through adversity and difficult times, as we shall as well. But it's, again, not just the interior, it's about maybe her mind and this idea of repair, and this idea of getting through and across that threshold for all of us to someday, reemerge and come out of our shells and enjoy life again. And again, this is before that roaring 20s, jazz age, gin age kind of excitement of the 1920s. This is that period of repair. And again, that sounds kind of heavy, but I'm just trying to relate to you that that is updated Vermeer right there. The careful nature of the composition, the idea of the meditative kind of thinking, going beneath the surface of that composition and what is represented. Well, I should also mention, by way of conclusion, that this is the last of the 7 lectures that I had a chance to record with Viking prior to COVID-19. There are 2 more lectures that are in the docket that Paul Dawson has filmed for his series on the history of France, parts 1 and 2. You'll have to look, we will all look forward to those. But looking forward also to some other ideas and surprises that are out there for using Tuesdays with a resident historian to our full advantage. But if you've enjoyed these, please let Viking know. Again, we're navigating this and we're kind of pulling together ideas as we go along. But I have to say, with my hand across my heart, thank you so much for your dedicated interest in learning, great questions, curiosity about our world. And I do hope that someday, some corner of the globe, our paths may cross. Please introduce yourself, and I promise you, we will pick up exactly where we've left off. Thank you.